The Canandaigua Treaty Committee works for a year to put these events together, and the Friends of Canandaigua, over the last 2 years, they have taken over the commemoration, still working with some of the original members of the committee. And each and every year we search for a speaker, someone who will bring some new information or who will share with us their thinking, again, related to the treaty, the meaning of the treaty, because after all, that's really what we're here for. And I have to say, I'm very pleased to see so many young faces from the students from various schools that are here today. We hope that all of this will be informative to you. Oftentimes, when we look at the newspaper is fixated on a certain headline, and that headline really dominates all of the information you get about us, meaning Odowi or Seneca, if you will. That's the only information you get. It's what is in that headline. But behind that headline, of course, there's a larger story. But generally speaking, and I'm just being out front here, the writer does not have the background to be able to write that part of what the background is. Can't tell that part of the story. So we don't get that. We don't read that. And only when we get a chance to talk to individuals can we explain something about what the headline really meant. Our speaker this evening is a graduate of Harvard University, but before that he's a member of the Heron clan of the Seneca Nation, and he comes from one of our communities we call Ohio, or Allegheny. It is part of the Seneca Nation of Indians. It is located in the southern tier of New York State, and the city that is on our territory is called Salamanca. So if you want to locate it specifically, that's where I'm talking about. In our system of government, the Seneca Nation of Indians, we have an elective system. We elect a president, and it alternates every 2 years. 2 years it's from the Cattaraugus, next 2 years it's from Allegheny. So this year our president is from the Allegheny Territory. His name is Robert Odowi Porter, and he is a lawyer by training, a graduate of Harvard, as I mentioned, and also on leave from Syracuse University. Would you put your hands together and give Mr. Porter a welcome?
Thank you all for having me tonight. It's a little hot in here, and I'm a little worried because in the spirit of our people and our traditions, I was told that I need to keep you entertained and enthused and educated for the next 4 to 5 hours. We don't put ourselves on the clock, and I'm equally shocked that we're starting on time. I don't know that I've been in a meeting that started on time for quite a while. But I'm very honored to be here, and I want to thank Peter and the organizers for what has been an increasingly prominent and important event, in the history of the Haudenosaunee, and importantly in the history of the non-Haudenosaunee. That I have not been to this event in many years, and it's very exciting to see so many people who celebrate the meaning of the Canandaigua Treaty and its significance for all of us today. That whether you appreciate it now, whether you appreciate it later, but it's these kinds of agreements, it's these kind of historical moments that you could quite literally look back upon and say, if our people, the American people, had not done this, we may not have survived. And I think for Haudenosaunee people, if we look back upon this and we say, if we did not enter into peace with the Americans at the time, we may not have survived. So I think today, for us to be here on the 217th anniversary, is a very exciting thing, and I'm very honored to be here. Now, I will not talk for 4 to 5 hours, just to give you some assurance, but I do want to talk somewhat extensively about what I think that this treaty means to us all in the days in which we are now living, as we set forth and look to the future of the significance of the treaty in our lives as Haudenosaunee, Oneida, Seneca people, and American people. So I want to talk about really a sort of framework of discussion that's rooted in why is this treaty important? And try to set forth a few answers for why it's important for us today. I also want to explain why I believe that our treaty is under attack and why it remains vulnerable to what is going on around us. And I want to give you an explanation in historical context for why that's true. I also want to spend a little bit of time explaining why I think there are things that we can all do together to continue to value and acknowledge the Canandaigua Treaty and how we can make it stronger in the future. Because that's important, I believe, for all of us, and quite frankly, the Haudenosaunee, who historically are now on the short end of a lot of the historical events that have occurred over the last 217 years. So to begin, why is this treaty important? This is a challenge. It is a challenge for any discussion of history. Why is something that happened 217 years ago important today? Well, let's just run through what the Canandaigua Treaty actually did. So the number one thing was that the treaty established peace between the Six Nations and the United States. It's a peace treaty. It's an agreement that we will not wage war against each other and that we will live together in peace. Now, I don't know about you, but there's an awful lot about human history that seems to tell us that we like to war. We like to fight with each other. We like to fight for food. We like to fight for ego. We like to fight for land. That peace moments, maybe more rare than we think. But to have this opportunity to live in peace, that's what this treaty primarily expresses. In so doing, this treaty recognizes the national sovereignty of the Six Nations. It recognizes our nationhood, our distinct political status, separate from the American nation, the United States. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Because of the passage of time and the passage of history, to be recognized as a separate people is significant. Thirdly, it recognizes our land base. The treaty recognized that we have our own lands. Of course, it was once all ours. And those of you who were there earlier this morning to understand the teachings of the Guswenta, the Turo Wampum, we accepted early on that we did not have to maintain control over all of what was once ours. That we could welcome in our brothers and sisters from across the ocean and that we could live together in peace. What that really meant, the subtext, the regulations, the fine print, is that we would be willing to give up some of our lands and waters to our brothers and sisters, up to a point. We maintain our separate societies. And the interesting thing about the promise that was made to us, about recognizing our land base, the title to our lands, is that the United States recognized and promised us something that it promised no other indigenous people, that we would retain the, quote, free use and enjoyment of our lands. Quote, free use and enjoyment. Those are magic words. They're magic words because no other of the several hundred Indian treaties entered into between the United States and Indian nations has the exact same language, and so too because of what that really means. Free use and enjoyment means the United States will not interfere in our business. We decide in our own nations how we govern ourselves. And we live it, it's a philosophy as much as it is a legal term. And the last thing that it really recognizes, it's somewhat a derivative of these other concepts, is it recognizes that we are citizens of our own nations. A nation does not enter into a nation does not enter into treaties with its own people. It only enters into treaties with foreign peoples. And so we are recognized as having citizenship, political status, separate and apart from the United States. Those are the basic key elements of why this treaty is important. And there's more I want to say about this, but I wanted to lay that framework out of peaceful relations, recognition of national sovereignty, recognition of land base and title, recognition of the free use and enjoyment, and then lastly, recognition of our citizenship. Very important elements, all of which continue to exist to the present day. Now, turning to the problem. The problem is that the promise has not always been lived up to on the part of the United States. That we have lived with these constant attacks on our status, on all of these elements that we have been promised 217 years ago. So I want to take a little bit of time to explain to you what this treaty means, because it's taking a departure point almost from the beginning. We think it means one thing, we Haudenosaunee, and the Americans think it means something else. And I want to talk about the acts of Congress, the court cases, the decisions and actions of the political government officials in the American government, because that reflects, among other things, their interpretation of what the treaty means as we move through time. And from the perspective of our nations, I believe that our understanding of this has remained somewhat static, that we have always understood what was promised to us. We have always understood our obligations. And to my knowledge, I could stand corrected, but I don't believe, for example, that in the last 217 years, the Haudenosaunee have declared war on the United States. If anybody can recall that, let me know. But I do believe we've lived up to our promise that we would live in peace with the American people. We've had some skirmishes over the years, but no formal declarations of war. And I think that's important. And as far as I know, even though there have been some disputes over land issues, which I'll get to in a minute, we've otherwise left alone the United States in terms of the operation of its society, which we had promised in 1794. So let's look at these attacks that have occurred over the years. And there's really, quite honestly, way too many. It would take 4 or 5 hours to delineate them. But it is something I wanted to share with you. So I'm going to break it down first into the attacks on our treaty status and our rights by the U.S. courts. Now, you have to keep in mind that in the 19th century, the U.S. Supreme Court was also evolving as an institution. And this notion that the courts would become so dominant as it relates to Indian rights was really kind of a foreign concept. The very early decisions of the U.S. Supreme Court were rooted, dealing with natives, were rooted in this notion that the federal government had the exclusive right to interact with Indian nations. And it's rooted in the Constitution, in the Indian Commerce Clause, as a very essential ingredient that it is only the United States that has the authority to engage in relations, economic, treaty, political relations with the Indian nations, as opposed to the state governments. And for those of you who are students of American history, you know about the Articles of Confederation, and you know about the foundation of states' rights in the federalism. There was a lot of turmoil in the American government, you know, arguably still to this day, but at least in those early years, figuring out who had the power, the states or the federal government. So the Supreme Court evolved throughout the 19th century, and you have to put this in context, I guess, of also who were what were native peoples under the law at this time. We had a treaty relationship. And I think to get your head around this, you have to envision native peoples and our nations being perceived much more like Canada or Mexico today. You know, foreign peoples, foreign nations in relation to the American government. There's a great book I picked up a few years ago that had all the editorials in the New York Times written about native peoples. Because we were the big news, you know, for most of the country's history. And we were treated and thought of in varying ways, ranging from, you know, our friends and neighbors to the historical equivalent of Al-Qaeda, frankly, you know, in terms of, you know, these terrorist peoples trying to destroy the United States. So the Supreme Court, throughout the 19th century, involves different doctrines, you know, that are rooted in establishing the power of the United States. What emerges is the plenary power doctrine, that federal law is supreme as it relates to Indian affairs, that you can displace and push away state power in favor of the federal government. And through the 19th century, it involves doctrines that were called through the Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock case, the treaty abrogation rules, where you can break an Indian treaty regardless of what the treaty says, and there's no recourse against the United States. That's a matter of American law, that you can bend an Indian treaty over your knee and violate it, and there's no recourse. Now, we didn't like that, of course, but it becomes part of American law that these notions exist, because we're not citizens, we're not seen as citizens, we're seen as these foreign nations, these foreign peoples, and the law evolves in a way that becomes very, very problematic. So by the time you start dealing with very specific court cases, And it takes a long time for there to be specific court cases dealing with the Haudenosaunee. Why is that? Well, most folks who have a treaty don't think that the way to protect the treaty rights is to go litigate. You know, and you also have to keep in mind that it wasn't until 1966 that Indian nations could even enter the federal courts without permission of the United States, because we were not viewed as full, legal persons, for that matter. So there comes a storm on these issues, and the first big ones really deal with the Tuscarora Nation and the Seneca Nation, in terms of the government, in particular the state government's need, and the federal government's need, for land for power projects. The Robert Moses era, the St. Louis Seaway era, the Niagara River Power Project era of the 1950s. And so this is the low point in American policy towards natives. It's called the termination era after World War II. Terminate these Indian tribes. Rip up those treaties. Oh, did we tell you? In 1924 we made you citizens even though you didn't like it, even though you didn't ask for it. You don't need to be citizens of your own nations. Rip those treaties up. Oh, and we want your land. We want your land because we didn't steal enough of it in the first place. We need it now for our power projects. The courts get involved in these disputes. And for the first time we see our nations really, there were other cases throughout the years, but we start seeing a response rooted in, we need to lawyer up to deal with this. And so the Tuscarora case, the takings case, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came down with a rule that said, well, Congress passed a law that said that their lands could be taken, sort of, but because they really can't demonstrate a very clear right to occupy the lands that they're on, we think Congress's intent was enough. We're going to take their land for this project. And a considerable amount of Tuscarora land is taken for the Niagara River Power Project reservoir, causing dislocation and disruption. This is in the heels of an era, as I mentioned, this termination era, where you've got other court cases that say you can take Indian land without paying any compensation at all. It's not viewed as legally meaningful for purposes of the constitutional takings clause. So this is a very a sort of frustrating time, but when you start seeing the court cases, you realize, oh my gosh, we're going to lose these. This is a terrible thing. Termination era, judicial plenary power, you've got lots of power and money behind the governments. How are we going to survive this? And that's when my nation has to deal with the Kinzua project that emerged in the 1930s as a flood control, ostensibly a flood control project to save Pittsburgh and the downstream communities on the Ohio, the Allegheny River, from flooding. This thing was being concocted for decades before our leaders really appreciated what was happening. And sure enough, they need 10,000 acres of our Allegheny territory, 1/3 of it, for this reservoir. Well, we entered the courts and we lost. And the government upheld the taking of what became known as a flowage easement, the use of the waters in our lands for purposes of reservoir backup. We didn't really even get paid for that. The government has this notion that all of the water in the entirety of the United States belongs to the United States. And it's called the navigational servitude. And so you can't pay someone to take the navigational servitude because the United States already owns it. We did receive some amount of money for the relocation, but the hundreds of our people who had their homes burned, whose lives were disrupted and dislocated, in express violation of the Canandaigua Treaty, that we were promised that our lands would not be disturbed until we decided to sell them. There was no more naked of a violation, and it stands as the largest land-taking violation by the United States. And this was only 45 years ago. This was not that long ago. And so the 10,000 acres were taken now, not in title. We still own title to these lands, and it's relevant today because we're in the process of trying to get the hydro facility under our control as one element of the justice of this issue. But I'm just telling you, in terms of the way the law evolves, the courts just go right along with what the government wants, and they ignore what we think the treaty actually means. Another case that came up about almost 20 years ago now dealt with some Mohawks, the Lozors, who thought that the treaty, the free use and enjoyment language in the treaty, meant they didn't have to pay any federal income tax. And there's a whole history about sort of the income tax issues, but never once has the Congress passed a law that said Haudenosaunee people have to pay income tax to the United States. The only way they get there is they say, well, in 1924 we made you all citizens, and the tax code applies to all citizens, so therefore you have to pay too. But expressly, there has never been any statement of income tax collection. So that's a glorious case, and I recommend it to you to read it. Lazore versus Commissioner from 1993 was a Third Circuit case, because it's a beautiful case. There's a lot of history, there were a lot of experts that were brought in, there was a lot of explanation. The court seems very sympathetic to the treaty rights concept that we did not negotiate for income tax collection on our income. Where did that come from? That was 1913. That was a whole American thing. But the court said, you know, the problem is under American tax law, we presume everyone has to pay tax. And the only way you get out of it is you need a specific exemption. And we know it's impossible for you to have had an exemption in the 1794 Canandaigua Treaty, because the tax code didn't exist yet. But, sorry, you lose. Pay. And that's the kind of frustrating violation of our rights that you see. Free use and enjoyment. What does that mean? Seems to me it means some other government doesn't kind of reach in and take off 15 or 25 or 35% of your income, and if you don't, send you to jail. That doesn't seem quite right as it relates to free use and enjoyment. Most recently, we have dealt with American courts dealing with issues of land. The Sherrill case, the Cayuga land claim case, these are cases that are rooted in what's called the Non-Intercourse Act, the Trade and Intercourse Act. One of the very first things that the Congress passed in 1790 was a law that said, no one shall do business with Indians for land without the permission of the United States. No speculators, no state governments. Only the United States, under American law, has authority to acquire and extinguish Indian land title. Well, it seems pretty clear to me what that means, but New York State, being New York State, those of you who may think of New York State as a rogue state, it started much sooner than the modern era, goes way back to the beginning, where the state of New York is routinely ignoring the Non-Intercourse Act and entering into land deals with Indian nations. I think most significantly the Oneidas, in terms of the number of agreements that were entered into without the permission of the United States. Every one of those agreements are illegal. They're invalid. They have no force and effect under the law. And the Oneidas started filing suits on this back in the 1970s, early 1970s, just a few years after the federal courts opened up. Well, interestingly enough, the Oneidas started winning, and they win these first couple of rounds. And it's an amazing thing for the Supreme Court to stand on the tiptoes of justice and say, it was a long time ago, but the state violated the Non-Intercourse Act, and so therefore the title remains with the Oneidas. Now there's this little issue, there's a good number of non-Indians living on their land, and they've established civil society and government. What do we do with them? How does that get addressed? So the most recent cases deal with the efforts of the Oneidas to buy back their own land, thereby extinguishing the non-Indian occupant. If you get paid for your land in America, you get to move to Florida, I guess. That seems to be what a lot of New Yorkers do. They get out of the state. Well, if you're buying land within the Oneida or the Cayuga, original reservation, the Oneida took the view, and the Cayuga took the view. Well, then we have our land back. It's restored to the status that it was way back 200 years ago, because the non-Indian is now gone, and Congress never took that land from us. Makes sense? Wrong. And this is where the Supreme Court eventually says, in the Sherrill case just a few years ago, 2005 I believe it was, sorry, because of the passage of time, we're not going to recognize that you have full sovereignty over your territory. Sorry. And it really chides me, because I had a colleague when I was on the Iowa faculty who said, Porter, we all know that the law, that when someone steals someone else's land, is that you get it back with damages, unless you're an Indian. And I said, no. No, the law is the same for everybody. He says, nope. No, it's not the same. The Indians don't get their land back, and they don't get paid. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court said in the Sherrill case. Yeah, we know that it's yours, but it's been so long, and the disruption would be so great to the non-Indians that we cannot allow your sovereignty to be restored in terms of recognition. And that's really unfair. It's also illogical from an American law perspective, but that's what the Supreme Court did. This was just a few years ago. And I can't tell you how agonizing it is to see cases like the Cayuga case. The Cayugas, who have been so suffering their diaspora for 200 years, of being fragmented, of losing all their land, of trying to get it back, of fighting relentlessly, to have a $248 million judgment decided in their favor. You would not only get your land back, but you get $248 million. And then to see the courts wipe it right out. Sorry, the Sherrill case invalidates. You lose nothing. You get nothing. So we're at the point in terms of attack by the U.S. courts on our native rights, where you almost have to take the position that the courts do not recognize the treaty at all. And it's somewhat of a provocative statement, but when you look at what you're trying to get in a judicial forum, when you say, I've got this treaty, it was promised to us 217 years ago. Where can we go in the American government to get these rights recognized? Let's go to the courts. Well, the problem now is that the courts will not recognize meaningful title. They'll recognize, oh sure, that's your land, but it's occupied by non-Indians and you have no sovereign power to do anything about it. You have to go back to Congress to get it fixed. We, the courts, cannot and will not do it. It's not a judicial matter. That's very frustrating. Now, that's why I want to set the foundation for why going to the court system is a very, very, very risky thing to do. Because the courts, whether it's a matter of politics, I mean, and you might say it is, because these land claim cases test the ability of the American courts to dispense justice. You know, some of you may remember from history or life the Civil Rights era. Well, it's kind of an impressive era when you think about it, because the courts, the American government, I mean, they were sending the military, the army, into the South to enforce desegregation orders. They weren't fooling around when they were talking about desegregate now. We're going to send federal troops down there to make it happen. You didn't see the same kind of courage when it came to dealing with restoring Indian land title that had been promised in 1794. Just the opposite. We're going to run from that issue. It's too hard. It causes too much disruption. There's too many non-Indian lives that would be affected. And from a historical perspective, I think is a very a problematic moment when you think about the ability of the American courts to dispense justice. Now that's just one threat. The next comes from the Congress. And it's interesting when you lay out the historical trajectory over the last 217 years, Congress doesn't do too much. There are big moments. And the biggest moment was the removal treaty in 1838. That was part of the era of the time. And I love, when I was teaching actively, I love talking about this with the students because putting it into historical context, it was actually the case that the American leadership didn't think that the country needed much more land, other than maybe to the Mississippi. I mean, how much more land could we need? And so it was rooted in removal. We'll send the Indians west of the Mississippi. And sometimes it was ugly, like the Trail of Tears. Sometimes it was just corrupt, like the Buffalo Creek Treaty of 1838. Sometimes it was just cash. And there were rational decisions made by Native peoples during this period that, hey, the Americans are putting on the table, relocation expenses, money for new lands and homes west, plus they promised to actually leave us alone. We like it here, but we like the promise of being left alone. If we can't get it here, we'll go across the Mississippi. The Removal Treaty of 1838 was a big deal. It was part of a federal policy that the Congress was fully endorsing, and it was pretty close. And in the Seneca Nation, I was really impressed by the representative from the Quakers who were here today, because it's true, the Quakers helped us expose the corruption of that treaty. It exposed, frankly, the weaknesses of some of our leaders. It exposed the weaknesses, certainly, of those trying to get our land. And it was a matter of time in which this compromise notion is not that it was our compromise, it was a compromise forced down upon us. Our proposal was at the time we would take a little bit of the land from the Allegheny, the Cattaraugus, the Buffalo Creek, and the Tonawanda territories. We'd look down a little bit more, and that would satisfy, hopefully, the speculators. No. They wanted all of Buffalo, because Buffalo was where all the action was economically, and they had to have the whole thing. And what's that? Greedy. It was the greed, sure. The canal, the development. Buffalo was a big boom town, and they had to get us out of the way. And so the compromise was forced down upon us, and we were able to restore our title to Allegheny and Cattaraugus. And the Tonawandas, the Tonawanda Senecas, our brothers and sisters, were able to secure a treaty in 1857 that allowed their lands to be resecured. But the point is that Congress failed, for the most part, in removing us. And in many ways, you might say, because we're just stubborn. I mean, that's my view of it. We're really stubborn people. And the Senecas here, you know what I'm talking about. I see some in the back, wanting to heckle me probably, but you know how stubborn we are. And it's because I can imagine coming home someday and saying, well, I think we've solved this problem with the Americans. We've agreed to give up all of our lands and move to Kansas. Whoa. There's a whole chapter of history here, but there's a reason why we had a revolution in effect in 1848. Our people wanted a different kind of government. And that's how we established our constitutional republic on our own in 1848. And I'm the 67th president who's been elected since that time, because it was our choice of the Senecas at Allegheny and Cattaraugus to take that path. But look at what the Congress does to us in the modern era, the 20th century. We get acts like the Citizenship Act. You're all a little too savage for us. We need to make you part of our society. This is a radical concept in the 19th century. Making citizens, making Indians citizens was viewed as almost the practical equivalent of taking the beasts of the forest and making citizens out of them. No one really believed it. Indians? Citizens? No. But by the 20th century, it became a very powerful tool. Aha! If they're citizens, then they don't need to have their treaties, and they don't need to be citizens of their own nation. This is political assimilation. And our Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, opposes and rejects the Citizenship Act in 1924, but it's done anyways. We're the only group of people who are collectively naturalized against our will. We're Americans whether we like it or not. Everyone else gets to choose. In 1948, this termination era kicks in, and it's about jurisdiction and control. New York State has been our predatory tormentor from the beginning. And in 1848, you know what New York State wants? It wants their criminal jurisdiction over us, put in stone. Now, they've been exercising it for many years, decades, when no one was watching, because a lot of the federal government wasn't watching. And in 1942, there was a case that came out of Salamanca, where the Second Circuit said, you know what? State of New York, you don't have any jurisdiction over the Indians of the state. It freaked out the state officials. And they ran right to Congress, and they couldn't have gone at a better time. Because the Congress in 1948 was all about getting out of the Indian business. Fine, we'll give criminal jurisdiction over to the state of New York. And 2 years later, the Congress allowed the state courts to hear cases involving Indians, which in many ways has a much more effective social engineering function. You know, that when you have natives in your courts, you know, social welfare matters and civil disputes, you're really bringing the law to people. And it has a sort of educational effect in a crude kind of way by virtue of having natives suing and being sued in state courts. I mentioned the Power Act takings. Those are acts of Congress. And most recently, we've dealt with something called the PACT Act. One of the interesting stories in the Seneca Nation narrative is that in the last few decades, we sold a lot of cigarettes. A lot. And I've frankly learned more about cigarettes and cigarette law and regulation and resistance than I ever would have thought imaginable. And I know cigarettes are bad for you, but so is 200 years of being poor. And this ended up being a gift somewhat from New York State that just started taxing cigarettes more and more and more, to the point where you pretty much have to be stupid to not be selling them because of the tax arbitrage opportunity. And in our nation, unlike others in the Six Nations, we have a private sector. We have a lot of people. We have 8,000 people, and a lot of our private businesses got into it, started selling cigarettes. Well, it got to the point, and this is kind of a, I don't know how I feel about it to this day, but it was about 2007, we're sitting down with the federal government, and this mail-order cigarette business is being discussed. And I'm reading the federal GAO reports on mail-order cigarettes, and it says 70% of the cigarettes sold in the United States are emanating from the Seneca Nation. I think 70% of the cigarettes sold in the United States through the mail comes out of the Seneca Nation. I said, that can't be right. I said, this is another railroad. This is an unbelievably, bald lie about our nation. So we sit down at the meeting, and I said just what I said. I said, why are you doing this? Why are you taking this from our people? I said, this is your commerce. It's not an illegal product. If you don't want us to sell these, wipe them out for everybody. But we should have the same rights. They says, well, those numbers are wrong. I said, I knew they were wrong. He says, yeah, it's 80%. Because we've wiped out a bunch of guys in Kentucky, and by virtue of, you're left standing, you have 80% of the market. And I said, wow. But guess what? And last year, Congress enacted the legislation to wipe out mail-order cigarettes, making illegal the use of the mails for selling cigarettes. It is about as specific a Seneca Nation Cigarette Trade Termination Act as it gets. When you're controlling 80% of the market, who do you think they're talking about when they're talking about this legislation? And I spent a lot of time working on it, and it was a confluence of the right reasons in the sense that, of course, it's cigarette smoking, and, people don't like that. But there were reasons rooted just, frankly, in just profiteering of big companies like, Altria, Philip Morris. They didn't like to see the Seneca Nation getting too big a share of this market. But the Congress passed this legislation almost unanimously. And actually the guy, our previous congressman, Mr. Massa, was helping us protect our treaty rights. And I know he had some personal issues, but he was a good friend of ours, and he was helping us. He was helping us fight to protect our treaty, that we should do business in our own land as we see fit. We didn't sell to minors, we did all these regulations, we had stamps, we had verification, we had an agreement with ATF, the federal government. We were working in partnership. It's not an illegal product. Congress stopped it. So that's the kind of thing that happens if you're too good at something. And in our view, it was a violation of our free use and enjoyment. It was too much money, too much economy for the benefit of our people. Now there's more, and I've spent an awful lot of time on this, and I'll speed it up a little bit. There are attacks that come to us from federal agencies. OSHA, the National Labor Relations Board, EPA, the IRS. These agencies behave as though they're disconnected from the treaty. And I wrote an article about this, one of the last things I wrote while I was still a scholar, that really called this kind of neo-termination. That you have these agencies out there that have these, do-good missions. Protect the environment, protect workers. But when they're applying, their force on Indian land, particularly as it relates to Indian commerce, the casinos that emerge, construction companies, restaurants, other businesses that start to grow up, they just think that they're doing their job. And they kind of ignore the Indian lands component to this, and the treaties, and the sovereignty. And so these are good people. They just, frankly, are fulfilling an evil objective, as far as I'm concerned, because they're ignoring the treaty rights. that when a federal agent is in our territory or wants to be in our territory, they are the president's ambassador. And the first thing they should be doing is asking permission. Can we come in? So our president, and I've reaffirmed this, we have executive orders on the books. No federal official, certainly no state official, can come in to our territory and our governmental business without permission. We will likely agree, depending upon what you want to do, but you must ask permission. And these agencies, they don't think they have to ask permission. And we've had quite a few battles. We had a glorious battle over the grain silos that we were taking down in Buffalo to build our business there. Grain silos and asbestos. And we were following all the rules, but we weren't going to let the EPA come in to tell us that, you know, we were doing the right thing. We knew what we were, and they never asked permission. You know, we probably would have worked it out with them. So this is a big threat, a tax on our treaty freedoms. And then the big one, the historic one that's lasted for 200 years, the states. The state government is constantly trying to attack us. It's really, why is that? State governments do not have a treaty with us. They don't have a promise of peace. They don't have a promise of respecting our land title. And we think it makes sense that as American governments, that they should be living under the same legal requirements, because those are federal treaties, the law of the land, but that they behave as though they're disconnected. They're unanchored to those promises. And states are greedy. States want money, they want land, they want jurisdiction, and then they're backed up by a lot of greedy corporations and speculators who want to take our money. So we end up, once again, in the case of New York, fighting over taxes. And when everyone's poor, it's taxes on the land. But then we start having business ventures with non-Indians. We have customers coming into our territory. And the state of New York thinks it can tax the commerce in our territory with the non-Indian. Our position is pretty clear. That taxing authority stops at the territory line. If you want to tax your citizens, you know, who come into our land to buy cigarettes or gas or, you know, pencils or milk or whatever, that's between you two back home. You know, it's not our business to be your tax collector, and we will not be your tax collector. And so New York, you know, has been relentless in trying to tax our commerce. And the cigarette is, again, it's unique because it's a profitable product. It's a product that big companies are involved in. They don't want little companies involved in it. And it is because they have a great ability to orchestrate political and economic power. And so the courts, we fought in the courts for 30 years. And this last summer, we were unsuccessful in keeping the state from being able to tax the cigarettes that were imported into our nation and resold. Well, it took 30 years. And in our case, the state of New York thought they were going to, I mean, the rhetoric of this was unbelievable. There's $1 billion of money that the Indians are sitting on. If we could just tax their cigarettes, the state's budget problems will be eliminated. Well, guess what? We just happen to have evolved tobacco manufacturing businesses in our nation. And I think the last count from a couple weeks ago was $27 million had been generated statewide from new tax collections, presumably from the lost Indian sales. 1 billion, 27 million. You know, we could have told them that. I mean, anybody who lives within 25 miles of a state boundary is buying their cigarettes in that state, when New York State has the highest taxes in the country. But it's about the money. You know, I mean, it's nothing really more noble than that. I know there are many students here, and I don't know how you feel about this, but it's just kind of raw and ugly. You know, it's like, who cares what the treaty says? You've got something we want. We're going to take it. And that's what the cigarette litigation has been about. We see it now with gambling, gaming business. New York State promised us in 2002 that we would have the exclusive right, the Seneca Nation, to offer slot machines in western New York. That being west of State Route 14, which is about Geneva, right near here. And that was a promise. And the federal law requires it because the Congress, in this particular instance, respected our treaty rights that we would not be subject to taxes by the state. No taxes, charges, or fees on Indian gaming. But the state could sell you the exclusive right to offer slot machines in your area. So we bought it. 25% off the top. Everyone complains, oh, you don't pay me, the state. Boy, 25% is a crazy tax. You know, more than any other business would pay. But that's what the rate was. And so now they're talking about legalizing it everywhere. Oh, I've even heard the argument. This is all driven by, of course, our economic opponents, the operators of the racinos, who are trying to turn those businesses into casinos. Oh, Senecas, you'll be fine. You won't have to pay the state anymore. Well, we'll also lose our monopoly that was promised to us in 2002, and we won't make as much money, even though we're not paying the state. It's about economic contest and conflict. That's what's going on here. And it's being driven by the state. So we are actively engaged in advocating with the state officials. Live up to the deal that you made to us. And even if you don't care about the morality of living up to the deal, accept the economic reality that the Seneca Nation employs 4,000 people at our business, most of whom are non-Indians, and that do pay taxes to your government and support local communities in the entirety of Western New York. And that this Seneca business makes almost $700 million a year, and it brings it in, half of it from Canada, from Pennsylvania, from Ohio, from other parts of New York State, not from that local region. It's a big destination, our businesses. That's why it's good for everybody. But the point is, here we are once again. We had a deal, it was promised to us, and now we're having to spend time and energy and money to protect the deal that we thought should have been already secured until 2023. It's not fair. It's just not fair. But it is part of life. And there's no way to escape it in terms of what it means to be Haudenosaunee in this day and age. You always have to keep fighting. So, when we talk about why, it's about the money, I think. In the old days, the land was the money, right? I mean, land is wealth. And we lost much of our territory because of that economic conflict. And also because, frankly, maybe we were too generous and open with our immigration policy. You know, that we thought that two-row meant that there would be a point where we'd just be respected, but you know, these folks have an amazing ability to want more. And we may have underestimated the appetite. Well, today, it's still about the money. But interestingly enough, and I say this with pride, I really take it quite as an honor that part of the economic future, in my view, of Western New York is tied to the success of the Seneca Nation. And I believe that in my heart. I also believe because I have been told that by some of the captains of industry in Western New York, that if we can find a way to better work with the Seneca Nation and use and work with your economic position and your legal rights and your advocacy to create new jobs in Western New York, that's what's going to help keep Western New York from dying, more than perhaps any other one thing. And so that's a very new revelation that maybe even Seneca people have never fully appreciated about how integral important we are economically for the future. There's another big threat, and I don't have a real great answer to it, and that is that we're different. We're different people. We have a different society, and we have different values. And there's something rooted in Americanism that is hostile to different things. And maybe because the country itself is this unique amalgam of sort of peoples from all over, and that Americanism is this notion of creating something from nothing or from everything into something new and different. That it's a cultural pulverizer. And when we're surrounded by it, there's an innate instinct, I think, to want to destroy what surrounds us. Or excuse me, what we're surrounded by. And that's a thing to think about, actually. Because I taught a great class. It was probably one of the most fun classes I taught before I started being a politician, was at Syracuse, called Comparative Legal Colonialism, American Indian Nations and Iraq. Because the same rhetoric and the same justification, that these people are a threat to us. The number one, military. Number two, they have economically something that we want. For us, the land, and for them, the oil. And then thirdly, of course, the humanitarianism. If they could just live like us and be more like us, they'd be better off, and so would we. And that's exactly the same historical justification that was used to do what was done to us. And the historical narrative is hauntingly parallel to the modern times that we're living in with other people. The last big threat, I think, ignorance. When governments educate their people, like the United States does, to be almost virtually stripped of historical knowledge, I don't think it's an accident. I think if you know things about the past, you are afraid to do the same thing again if it's a bad thing. And you're more respectful of the good things. But when you look at what the American public education system is designed to do, to sort of teach just enough to be economic contributors, to teach just enough to be patriotic enough to die in a war, to be patriotic enough to be American enough to be able to serve the country. But don't think too much. Don't think too much about what you're doing, because you may end up not wanting to do what we, the government, want you to do. That's what we're dealing with. Right. And I was really impressed, quite honestly, when I came into this building tonight, and I saw these great murals. It's a public school teaching about our creation story, and about our treaty belts, and our history here in Canandaigua. And I thought, maybe there's a little bit more hope. Maybe there's some people here that are a seed, a catalyst of knowledge and understanding that could perhaps blossom. And I thought that was a really great thing. And so I think this ignorance is always a threat. It's a threat to all societies if people don't know. And I'm really glad to see that even though it's been a problem, there may be moments and opportunities for it to be undone. Now, what can we do about all of this in terms of protecting our treaty? I think it's a matter of personal commitment, but of course, it's a big problem. How can you deal with this at a bigger level? Become a personal ambassador, an advocate for understanding. And I think that's what this commemoration is all about. Not just non-natives, but Haudenosaunee people. You know, I was saying to my wife, and you know, my family's here tonight, and I'm glad that they're here. My mother, you really can't do anything in the Seneca Nation without taking your mother somewhere. You know, so she's here. You know, we go to work together. I mean, it's really, but I'm not the only one, so it is a cultural icon, I guess. But we have this obligation of our own people. And I'm worried that our own children, our own nation, don't know enough about their obligations to keep our treaty rights alive, to keep our government running. You know, I jokingly, half-jokingly say, well, if we don't teach our young people how to run our government, who's going to take care of us when we're old? And it's a very important thing to pass on these lessons, and we have to do that. Secondly, I think we can... just one second. I think we can teach politicians too. I think we can actually educate political officials about treaty rights. We saw one today. And he's a really good man, Tom Reed. I don't know what your politics are, or how you feel about him. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Seneca. I'm the president of my nation. And I believe, and I believe in the people who believe in us. And you can be a Democrat who's left to center, you can be a right-wing Republican, you can be a Green Party, I don't really care. How do you feel about our treaty rights? How do you feel about our sovereignty? And people come from all different stripes. I've seen them. I've worked in the government. I've been out there. There are good people who get it. And they may get it for a lot of reasons. They may get it because they're good people. They may get it because they're good people who also understand we employ 6,000 people in Western New York. We've had county legislative officials in our building saying things like, thank God for the Seneca Nation. You're the biggest employer in this area, and we want to keep working with you to make it happen. It's enough to floor you, given the hostility and conflict we've had over the years. Sometimes it's as simple as just reaching out, going into someone's office in Albany or Washington. How do you do? We're from the Seneca Nation. We'd like to teach you a little bit about who we are, what our issues are. It's hard. There's a lot of things that go on in people's lives, but sometimes it's a little easier than you think, and I think we can all do this with political officials, especially in this area. You know, I'd like to think that our Seneca Nation identity is everywhere. You know, our Haudenosaunee identity is everywhere. This was all ours. And someday, in a sense, it will be all ours again. We may not have the title, but if we are contributors and we're working together, I think these officials will get it, and they want to work with us. Thirdly, the international realm. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was finally acknowledged by the President of the United States last year. I was at the meeting at the White House summit that he convened where he announced the United States would support this. A little bit of murky lawyer language in the fine print about what that really means, but it's a start. If you don't know about the Declaration, it's worth researching and looking at, because for the first time, the nations of the world are recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples as being separate and apart from the lives of other citizens in various states. And it will serve as an important tool for us in the future to remain active. And our Confederacy, led by the Onondagas, has been involved in this for many, many years in shaping the Declaration and making it part of now the international law of the world. Two more things. Exercise power. We do that in our nation. Sometimes we do it really well. And it's a matter of having a government that's strong, that reflects the will of the people, that allows things to get done. And I spend a lot of time figuring out how to solve problems. How can we diversify our economy away from casinos and tobacco? How can we get into other businesses? How can we keep growth occurring? We don't have a tax base in our nation. The monies that we earn are used to support a social welfare system in our nation. Frankly, we have the healthcare system that Americans are still fighting over. It is something that our government does, and we don't collect a nickel of tax from anybody. I'm kind of afraid to tell people about that sometimes because people get a little jealous. But it's something that we feel is important for our nation, and I think more people can see the wisdom of that. But exercising power is a very important way of respecting the treaty and making it real. And at various times, all of our governments have had internal disputes, and we've had disagreements with our people. Wasting time fighting with each other is not respecting the treaty right to self-government and moving forward. And it's a hard thing sometimes. Our nation has certainly lived through it, but it is important to exercise the power. And then the last thing to say about what can we do about our treaty rights, Canandaigua Treaty, is we need to be smart. We always need to be smart. And I'm so impressed by the decisions that were made by our leaders long ago about our treaty rights, the decisions that they made. Now as the president for the last year, realizing how hard it must have been, how the battles must have occurred internally, fighting over such life and death issues about whether we relinquished most of our territory in 1797 in exchange for a $100,000 annuity that would support us economically. What must have been the conflict there? But being smart includes, based in my view of the record, stay out of the courts. Don't go to court with our treaties. Nations shouldn't, individuals shouldn't. It's a political document, it's a political promise that should be dealt with in the political realm. Because the courts simply can't be trusted with something as sacred and as valuable, as important as the promise made to us by the United States. A political promise. And that's just being smart. And we can see the consequence of bad decisions. And we have to resist the temptation to think there's an easy solution to anything. It's a political document, we should use diplomacy. We have had conflicts with the government, physical ones, violent ones in the last 20 years. And even today I was asked questions by the media about some eminent discussions of maybe new efforts by the state to try to tax the cigarettes made in our territory, about whether there would be violence if these things happen. And I tried to make it very clear, as I always do, every nation and people have the right to defend themselves against threats. But my job as the president is I'm the chief diplomat, and we have a 16-member council. And we're the peace chiefs of the older era living today. And our job is to find practical solutions to difficult problems. But if we fail, if we can't take home a good answer to the people, well, then you're going to have to deal with the people. And sometimes they're not going to be very happy about it. And I guess that, in our nation, is part of what that treaty's about. Is that we have struggled for survival, we have fought vigorously through all kinds of odds, through all kinds of efforts to destroy us. And I think as we live today, We need to just accept the history that we've lived through. We need to be empowered by it. We need to find new ways to make our treaty, our Canandaigua Treaty, vital and useful for all of us. And I'm confident that we will be able, with a long-term focus, looking generations ahead, be able to achieve that goal and objective. So I'm very honored to be here tonight. I want to thank you for your time, and I'd be glad to take any questions if we have time for that, but otherwise, thank you very much. Yeah.
I want to thank Rob for what I think was giving us a really good breakdown of the issues that exist and the approaches that we have had to take and the realities that we're still dealing with. I know some of you want to get to the social, and I understand that. So let's take maybe just one or two quick questions over here.
Well, the question relates to the Oneidas and the Cayugas and getting land back. The interesting thing is the Oneidas reacquired, I believe, about 17,000 acres of land. They just simply bought it, through consensual transactions. And I think that the market forces there work wonderfully to solve problems. You don't have to force anybody to do anything, but there is a point at which you're willing to take someone's money to move. And I think that that's a really good way to solve problems like that. Just use normal market forces. And take time. It doesn't have to happen overnight. It can take many years to make it happen. Another question? Yes, in the back.
How about our fishing and hunting rights?
Hunting and fishing rights?
Yeah.
Specifically, what are you referring to in terms of hunting and fishing? On territory? Or?
Throughout the state.
Well, interestingly enough, in the 1797 agreement with Robert Morris and the Seneca Nation, it acknowledged that we would retain rights to hunt and fish in lands that were ceded, which is pretty much all of western New York. And there was a case, unfortunately, that was decided around 1960 called Kennedy versus Becker that took it all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, well, what that really means is you still have to follow state law. Doesn't make any sense at all. So there we have it. Another example of a treaty right that says something very clear that, of course, we would fight to retain hunting and fishing on lands other than what we were living on, because we needed it all to live. But then a Supreme Court case comes along in a particular dispute and just recognizes it. So it'll either take another Supreme Court decision or act of Congress to get those rights back. Yes.
You spoke wonderfully about the healthcare system within the nation. And I'd like to ask if those same medical and healthcare benefits are provided to all your employees.
Some of them, but not as a matter of employee policy, but we do provide them with pretty good health insurance. Our clinic services are drawn to family members of the nation, which may include we're a matrilineal society, so it may include the children and even the grandchildren. So it's a very broad service area. But we work with our employees. They have health insurance, and that's how we provide them.
More like the health insurance that is generally out there for
exactly.
a lot of the nation.
And our casino employees as well. Yes?
What have you done to reverse the Sherrill decision?
Well, the Sherrill decision, there is no reversal of the Sherrill decision. What the Sherrill decision means is that the courts will not be available to recognize Indian title and restore sovereignty, tribal sovereignty over that land. Go to Congress to do it. And so that's what is the next path, is to take these issues of land that has been wrongfully taken and go to Congress to get Congress to re-recognize our sovereignty and our title to that land. Seneca Nation, Tonawanda Seneca Nation, Tuscarora, we all have these non-intercourse violations. So the strategy that is being pursued now is these matters have to go to Congress. And unfortunately, Congress has a long list of Indian nations that have been denied land justice. And so it's almost, you got to take a number and get in line. You know, I mean, but that's unfortunately, I think, the path. So.
We got to go down. I think Rob asked before he leaves.
I don't know about that.
Okay, I just wanted to say that there is a November 18th and 19th, Syracuse University Law School is going to take up the subject of land justice. 2 days are going to be spent discussing just exactly what you're talking about. What are the options available to the nations now that you've had a decision like the Shell case and like the Cuban Nation case rendered? So, again, thank you all for your kind attention and for coming today.